Hello. I would like to give a lecture, or mostly read it actually, but also showing the virtual handout here on the screen. The topic of the lecture is on problems of music historiography, daily newspapers and music dictionaries as sources for history of music reception. Anyway, so I stay on time, on track. I will mostly read from my manuscript. So here you can follow on the screen. Introduction. Writing about music history has usually been writing about the history of music composition, as opposed to writing about the musical life. While the first history is mainly about the development of compositional techniques and, as such, an intellectual history of music composition, the latter is a rather sociological approach and tells us which music was performed and how it was received. Today's music dictionaries fall truly into the first category, but how about old music dictionaries that are 100 years or older? Or even a little less than that, for that matter. My presentation will specifically focus on Hugo Riemann's Musiklexikon, music dictionary, its German national focus, and its usefulness or uselessness for research on history of the musical life of the Germans in the late 19th and early 20th century. That means on the history of music reception. This latter point is being substantiated with with results of research on the German reception history of the music around 1920 in the city of Brno, which is based on extensive newspaper research. I will then talk about Hugo Riemann and his Musiklexikon, and I will present some comparative data that shows that Riemann's dictionary has a very clear German focus and a focus on the latest music. That means 19th century. So, chapter one on the musical life of the Germans around 1920. If we open a music history book, we can read about many composers who were famous at a specific point in time. However, those composers may not have played an important role of the musical life at their time. For instance, when we think about the time around 1920, such composer names as Leos Janáček, Edward Elgar, Giacomo Puccini, Arnold Schönberg, Alban Berg, Bela Bartok, Engelbert Humperdinck, Richard Strauss, Alexander Glazunov, Erik Satie come to mind, and many other living composers at the time, or even the, by 1920, deceased composers Gustav Mahler, Claude Debussy, etc. Now, during the academic year 1995 and 96, I completed a research project on the musical life of the Germans in the city Brno around 1920. Brno is the capital of Moravia and is located in the eastern part of today's Czech Republic. A very large population in the by 1920 Czech city Brno was German, and Brno was very much influenced in its musical life by Prague, Dresden, Berlin, and of course Vienna. Until 1918, Brno was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. At the end of World War I, Czechoslovakia declared its independence from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. As such, it very much mirrors the musical life on a smaller scale of Prague, Dresden, Berlin, and of course Vienna. Guest musicians from all of those cities came to Brno frequently, and Brno musicians traveled as guests to the larger cities. And because Czechoslovakia had just become a Czech country, Czech Republic and Slovakia were united at that time. This time period reflects those political changes, including the national and nationalistic tendencies. The basis of this research project was the Brno edition of the daily newspaper Tagesbote aus Mähren und Schlesien. Mähren und Schlesien, so daily daily news from Moravia and Silesia, literally translated, because it reported about the musical life most extensively. It was printed twice daily, except Sundays only once. I collected all the materials regarding music, and for 1920 alone, for instance, I copied and typed several hundred pages, actually for January 1920 alone, which I will show you here. I typed several hundred pages of reviews and music news into my laptop computer at that time. I collected information about all performances, genres, composers, and specific compositions. Furthermore, about music societies or musical activities of other societies. Um, and I also collected news about international musical developments to see how far the Germans in Brno were informed about national and international developments or news. Let me see if I have a list here um, of the music organizations. No, I don't, but I will read some of them here. Let me give you some more details so you can get an idea of the musical life of the Germans in Brno at that time. One of the main musical organizations for the Germans there was the Brunner Musikverein, the Brno Music Association, even though it was losing influence, probably also its financial strength. Furthermore, the Gesangsschule Mila Martini uh, Rimetz, singing school of Mila Martini Rimetz. I just used the English translation now. The Brno Amateur Theater and other musical organizations were hosting almost daily events in the concert hall of the Deutsches Haus, the German house, which had been built in 1891 in the city theater. Also, in addition to that, the City Theater, which had been built in 1882, as well as in smaller performance venues. They also had musical performances as well as plays in the Deutsches Schauspielhaus, the German theater, and the Mährisch-Schlesische Konzertdirektion, the Moravian Silesian Concert Authority, organized events such as the concert evenings of the Moravian Silesian Concert Authority. Furthermore, there were many amateur organizations that organized many musical events. These amateur organizations were, and I will read the English translated names, not the original German names. Of course, they were German organizations and they had German names, but the English translations are the Old Brno Men's Choir Club, the Brno Teachers Singing Club, and this organization had a man's choir, a woman's choir, and probably also a mixed choir, just to give you an idea of the richness of the musical life. The Brno Men's Choir Club, which consisted of the actual man's choir as well as a woman's orchestra. The Brno Typographers Singing Club, the German Academic Singing Club Marco Mannen. Marco Mannen was a Germanic tribe. They had a mixed choir as well as a women's choir. The German Guitar Club Brno, the German People's Singing Club Brno, the Dramatic Music Club Faust, the Evangelical Church Choir Club, the singing section of the Jewish Culture Club Ezra, the Society of German Music Friends, the Singer and Player Club of the German State Business School, the Schubert Alliance, the Student Orchestra, the Club Cheerfulness, and the Association of the Advancement of German Theater and Music Care. And this association organized, among other things, regular chamber music concerts. Thus, for the Germans in Brno alone, there was a great number of musical organizations that organized musical performances around 1920. In addition, there were non-musical organizations that also organized musical events, especially proms and social events with music. In January 1920 alone, there were 25 such non-musical organizations that organized musical events. In addition, proms and masked balls were also organized by the City Fire Department, the Brno Voluntary Rescue Organization, and by the Brno Gymnasts Fire Department. All of the organizations, musical as well as non-musical, had great influence on the musical life of the Germans in Brno at the time, just as it was the case in most other cities in Central Europe at that time. So let me give you some details on the musical event schedule. Just the event schedule of January 1920 alone shall be given here as an example on the screen to gain an understanding of the rich musical life at the time. The table shows or lists the titles of the composers' names. I omitted the names of the poets, the name of the performance venue, and other details. So simply the title of the composition and the composer. And here the left column is operas, operettas, then concerts, and other music events. All right, so I'll scroll this very slowly. If you want to read in more detail, you can pause the video. And almost at the end of January here. So about the opera and operetta performances, there were 36 performances in total in January 1920 with 18 distinct works. Of those 18, 9, half, are still very famous today. And they're listed here in bold. That I believe that are still well known or famous. So Martha, die Walküre, Siegfried, Cavalleria Rusticana, Hänsel und Gretel, Bajazzo, Tiefland, ein Walzertraum, and Die Rose von Stambul. The 11 other operas or operettas are lesser known today or forgotten. And those are Die beiden Schützen by Lortzing, Eva by Leha, Ein Tag im Paradies bei Eisler, Auf Befehl der Königin bei Granichsteten, Das Schwarzwaldmädel bei Jessel, Die Faschingsfee, Kallmann, Die tolle Komtesse, Kollo, Wo die Lerche singt, Leha, Die drei Kavaliere, Berthet und Die wunderbare Reise ins Goldkrautland bei Radlecker. Also er und seine Schwester bei Reimann. So Das Schwarzwaldmädel from 1917 by Leon Jesso, who was born in Stettin, today's Szczecin in Poland, is not as well known anymore as the performed works by Wagner, Flotow, Mascagni, Humperdinck, and so on, but is at least the only somewhat known work among Jessel's 20 operettas. Das Schwarzwaldmädel had its world premiere performance on August 25th, 1917 at the Komische Oper in Berlin and was then performed all over Europe. The same is true for Die Faschingsfee from 1917 by Austrian-Hungarian Emmerich Kallmann. Kallmann is today mainly known for his Czardas-Fürsten from 1915. While Albert Lortzing is still a very famous composer from today's perspective, his opera Die beiden Schützen from 1836 is not among the well-known works by Lortzing, and it was composed before his well-known Zar und Zimmermann, Der Wildschütz, etc. However, through the earlier 20th century, Die beiden Schützen from 1836 was very often successfully performed. The German-Hungarian composer Franz Leha is today mainly known for his operetta Die lustige Witwe. Thus, Eva from 1911 and Wo die Lerche singt from 1918 were composed after that. Leha was personally in Brno known because he had made several visits to Brno. Wo die Lerche singt was premiered in Munich, and Brno was the first city outside of Germany that performed his operetta. Die Tolle Comtesse from 1917 by the German composer Walter Kollo is not among the well-known works by Kollo anymore, but it was quite new in 1920, just 3 years old. Kollo was still in the process of establishing himself as a composer at that time. The Austrian operetta composer Bruno Granichstetten is nearly forgotten today, but his work Auf Befehl der Königin had great success in Vienna, with its Vienna premiere and performances for the following decade or so. The Austrian-Hungarian composer Heinrich Berthet was a ballet and operetta composer and is today only somewhat known for his operetta Das Dreimädlerhaus from 1916. However, he did not compose one melody for that operetta, as the melodies are taken from Franz Schubert's music. Within the first 6 years, that operetta had about 8,000 performances, so this success by far exceeds the success of his own operettas, meaning with his own melodies. The operetta that was performed in Brno in 1920, Die Drei Kavaliere from 1919, was new, just 1 year old, and can hardly be found in any publication nowadays. I'm certainly not aware of any recent performances. Some literature on the Austrian composer Edmund Eisler suggests that he was not critical enough in the selection process of the texts for his operettas. We now have only 2 works, Die Goldene Meisterin from 1927 and Bruder Staubinger from 1903, that is somewhat known today, but Ein Tag im Paradies, as it was performed in Brno in 1920 and composed in 1913, is not one of them, but it was successful for a few decades after it was composed. Alois Radlegger with his Die wunderbare Reise ins Goldkrautland and Rudolf Reimann with his und seine Schwester seem totally forgotten today. Among all the operas and operettas performed in Brno in 1920, in January 1920, 13 were composed in the past 25 years from the perspective of 1920. 13 composed within the past 25 years, and only 7 were older than that. That is astonishing, because if we think about today's performances, very few or very low percentage is actually recent work. But at that time, the majority was recent work, recent compositions. So 18 were composed in the 50 years prior to 1920. Thus, most works were new or relatively new, but interestingly, the newest works at that time, specifically all the works after 1907, are forgotten or almost forgotten today, with the exception of Die Rose von Stambul by Leon Fall. About the concerts, and I may scroll back here a little bit to wherever I read this, but this is the middle column. About the concert, I collected information about 20 concerts, although that is surely not a complete list, but even if it would be a complete list, it is quite remarkable, even if 5 of them were cancelled or moved to a later date. We certainly find composers who are famous from today's point of view, such as Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Bruch, Dvorak, Grieg, Haydn, Mozart, Paganini, Schubert, Strauss, and Wolf. Especially important was the Steiner String Quartet for the performance of music by these composers. But we also find composers who are lesser known from today's point of view, who are known to musicologists but not to a general public anymore. For example, Henryk Wieniawski, Fritz Kreisler, Franz Josef Gossek, and the Swiss composer, conductor, and musician Volkmar André was the president of the Swiss Tonkünstlervereins, the composers organization, but is very little known, already 50 years after his death. The Hungarian violinist Erna Rubinstein, who presented the concert, performed not only works by Bach and Brahms, but also works by the today lesser known or almost forgotten Henry Vieuxtemps, Jene Hubei, and Tor Aulin. There was also a church music concert on January 6th, here, with works by the forgotten Bohemian composer Wenzel Emanuel Horak, who was for a long time the choir director at the Teinkirche in Prague, by the forgotten Bavarian church musician and composer Karl August Leitner, by the Bruckner pupil Josef Gruber, who was at the time a music professor at a private teachers' college in Linz, and a church music composer, as well as by the Brno-born organist, choir director, organist, singer, and violinist Oswald Pavlik. Oswald Pavlik was directing this concert. A very different concert was that on January 19th by Josma Selim, here, and Ralph Benatzky. Ralph, or originally Rudolf Benatzky, lived from 1884 through 1987, was born in Meroš Budvic, today's Moravske Budějovice in Czech Republic, and grew up in Vienna. He earned a doctorate in philosophy, but also studied music on the side. For his first wife, Josma Selim, who was performing here, who lived from 1898 through 1929, he composed many songs and chansons. He also composed a great number of initially unsuccessful operettas, Singspiele, and revues. He wrote most of the texts and libretti by himself. Around 1920, he was known as the master of the musical comedy, and he worked in Vienna and Munich. Around 1920, he was known as the master of musical comedy, as I just read, and he worked in Vienna and Munich. Reviews in the local newspapers showed that the audience was thrilled about his music, but the music critic called him a minor composer, which became true historically. He's almost forgotten today, but some of the songs and chansons are recorded and were remastered on several CDs recently. Feel free to look up Ralph Benatzky and songs performed by Josma Selim. There are actually recordings available from the 1920s by Josma Selim. The scheduled concert on January 29th here was cancelled because of technical problems, but it would have been an interesting concert with forgotten or almost forgotten composers Anton Tomaszek, Eduard Chiari, F.R. Langer, Victor Merz. And the latter one, Victor Merz, was a pupil of K. Frotzler in Brno and later of Franz Schreker in Vienna, and then from 1918 on a factory owner in Brno. Only Egon Kornaut is not quite forgotten yet. He was born in Moravia, a pupil of Schreker and Guido Adler, wrote a doctoral dissertation about Haydn string quartets, and was later a music theory teacher, music critic, and composer. In the newspaper review, another composer is mentioned who could not finish his composition on time. Josef Witziner was born in Brno and studied also under K. Frotzler in Brno. The balls and dance events, which was the third column here, or which are listed in the third column, other music events, were also very important for the musical life of the Germans in Brno. But for time reasons, I will not discuss them further, except to say that were at least 26 such events during January 1920. Of course, this number may be high because of the carnival season. However, many of these events were also held to benefit a certain organization or cause. Some information about composers and musicians can be found in articles and reviews in the daily newspaper. Let me provide one short example, published in the morning edition of the Tagesbote on January 25th, 1920. This article, here it is. This article was an announcement of the January 29th concert, which was later cancelled. So I quote, "Among the works that will be performed, we need to highlight a Viola Sonata by the now with the Gustav Mahler Prize honored composer F. Kornau, two Lieder with piano quintet accompaniment by Tomaszek, Lieder by V. Merz and F. Langer, as well as a song cycle based on poems by A. T. Wagner and B. Weigel. The composer J. Vicina was prevented by illness to finish the work intended for this concert. At the same time, the composer and piano virtuoso F. Langer says goodbye from his Brno friends as he was called to, or contracted by, the Deutsches Landestheater, the German State Theater in Prague. Music director Frotzler assumed the accompaniment of the Kornau Sonata." End of quote. While very short, we do find information here about the composers and their works, which in the case of K. Frotzler and F. Langer are invaluable, as we have very few or no other sources on these composers. Reviews in the daily newspaper published after the concerts provide more detailed information about the works performed, but also about the composers and how they are perceived and received by the audience. One example shall illustrate that. It is the review of the evening with Josma Selim and Ralph Benatzky. The concert took place on January 19th. The review was published in morning edition of the Tagesbote on January 21st. And here is the quote on screen. "The vast majority of the audience cheered and enjoyed themselves exquisitely, but the 9 muses wheeled each their head at this giggling and laughing of their youngest, still nameless sister, who surely shows a distinctive artistic profile, but nothing classically masterful. Refined cabaret, good, that assumes and shocks, but all remaining in the framework of minor art," in German, Kleinkunst, "but no artwork. And still, that Josma Selim, equally rich on inspiration and creative originality as her husband, personal poet and house composer Dr. Ralph Benatzky, possesses a style and peculiarity, is just as a fact as her noble humor, not to be confused with the awful temperament that makes the jovial content of a verse flowing over its margins. A specialty by itself are Josma Selim's facial expressions, which are not part of her performance, but which are its involuntary reflex. This performance, full of rhythm, fancy, and womanlike clownery, is rich on overtones, as they call those tones in music that mysteriously accompany the sound of a buzzing string, and only then provide its rounding and fullness, the sound aroma, so to say. For that reason, the from Couplemanier manner, freed Vienna song is closest to the nature of Josma Selim, with its healthy, red-cheeked zest for life and its sentimental hardiness, which even today, after Dr. Ralph Benatzky's royalty experience, can conquer the world, at least for the lifetime of such a song, when it is masterly done in its kind. And that is much to find in Benatzky's cycles von der Liebe, on the love, von dem Reich der Mitte, from the Middle Kingdom, and Leute von heute, people from today. Classic masterly art is certainly something very different." End of quote. On the one hand, the music critic blasts these songs as minor art, but also confesses that it is done well and presented well. There is also a hidden critique on the commercial aspect of this kind of music, but it is certainly not high art. I would like to summarize my findings from this case study. Most compositions performed were relatively new, composed only within the past 20 to 30 years. Many of the composer names are little known today or totally forgotten. Some of them still have a tiny dictionary entry nowadays, and others do not. And others, such as Eduard Chiari and F. Langer, have never been mentioned in any dictionary. I wanted to find as much information about all composers as possible, so I used old editions of Riemann's Musiklexikon to find any information I could. Composers that were celebrated at the time, for example, Anton Tomaszek. He was mentioned only in the 11th edition of the Musiklexikon, which was published in 1929. He was born in Brno, was a composer and violinist, and composed the opera Das Steinerne Herz from 1925. He also wrote orchestra music and much chamber music. That's what we can read there in the 11th edition of Riemann's dictionary. About Victor Merz, we can read about him in the 10th and 11th editions of the Musiklexikon. That means the one from 1922 and the one from 1929. He was born in Brno, studied chemistry and then composition, and he was a pupil of K. Frotzler in Brno and later of Franz Schreker in Vienna until 1914. From 1914 on, Merz lived in Brno, composed orchestra music and much chamber music. That's what we can learn in Riemann's dictionary. Charles Weinberger. Weinberger had an entry in the Musiklexikon from the 5th through the 12th editions. So that means from the 1900 edition through the 1929 edition. Weinberger was an Austrian composer of operettas, studied music in Geneva and Vienna, and became professor of composition in Vienna in 1928. He composed more than 20 operettas, such as Adam and Eva, Adam and Eve, from 1899, Die romantische Frau, The Romantic Woman, from 1910. He also wrote the opera Das Sonnenkind, The Sun Child, from 1929, as well as chamber music. That's what we can learn in Riemann's dictionary. And finally, Leo Hans was mentioned only in the 10th and 11th editions of the Musiklexikon, that means in 1922 and in 1929, and Leo Hans was the artist name of the woman composer Lili Scheidel-Hutterstrasser. She was born in Vienna, where she studied music and composed orchestra, chamber music, and at least 3 operas. Her opera Maria von Magdala from 1919 was widely performed and well known. In the daily newspapers, musicians were certainly mentioned too. The violinist Erika Marini, who lived from 1904 through 1995, for instance, cannot be found anymore in any major dictionary today, but she was listed in the 11th and 12th editions of Riemann's dictionary. Many of the composers who are very little known today or even totally forgotten were of equal importance to the masters of the time from today's point of view. Karl Geidner, for example, was mentioned in the 1920s newspaper with the same respect as Franz Schreker, Charles Weinberger, with the same Charles Weinberger with the same respect as Offenbach. Composers like Josef Wietziner, Josef Gustav Mracek, Ralph Benatzky and Heinrich Granichtetten were also as well known as Schreker, Johannes Brahms, and Offenbach. On the other hand, composers like Janacek, Schönberg, Berg, Weber and Pfitzner, Honegger, Milhaud, Orff, Prokofiev, Satie, and others were mentioned extremely seldom in the Brno newspapers around 1920. And just as a reminder, besides announcements of all the concerts, there were also news from around Europe about musical performances. So, in all, those famous composers were mentioned relatively seldom. Certainly, the musical events had a sociologically different function than our musical events today. Thus, we would have to search for reasons of forgetting some geniuses or heroes of that time in the different social circumstances. And this is the reason why methodological presentation of music history based on today's social structures and circumstances will fail with regard to the musical life of the past. Those music histories, and even or especially if we talk about the composers one can find in today's music dictionaries, and the reception of the works will always be a history of composition and not a history of musical life. Second chapter, Hugo Riemann and his music dictionary. So here I actually have a list of all the editions of the Riemann works, and I'll show the first few and then scroll down a little later. It was for the research I just summarized when I got to value Riemann's dictionary. In various editions of it, I found information on composers and musicians on which I could not find any information elsewhere. But there were still many composers that even Riemann did not mention. In this part of my paper, I will focus on Riemann and the German orientation of his dictionary, as well as on his emphasis on the most recent music history. And since we're talking here about dictionaries that were written between 1882 and until the early 1920s, well, he died in 1919, so the 1919 edition was the last edition he personally edited. When we talk about most recent music, we talk about the 19th century. Riemann was born in 1849, was a gifted pianist, and studied philology, history, and philosophy, and later music. I'm just scrolling up here for you to see some other editions of his dictionary. He completed a dissertation translated on musical hearing, but it was rejected at Leipzig University. With the support of the German philosopher Hermann Lotze, it was eventually accepted in Göttingen in 1873. Riemann held various teaching positions such as in Hamburg, Wiesbaden, and Leipzig. In Leipzig, he was promoted to professor in 1901. He became a celebrated teacher and strongly influenced the musicological, music theoretical thought of the first half of the 20th century. Riemann believed that musicology should explain, I quote, the spiritual and expressive nature of the primitive elements of all musical experience to ascertain the physical properties of tones and the mechanical conditions governing their creations. End of quote. Musicologists should not only study, I quote, the simple, most basic manifestations of this tone material, but also the complex, richly differentiated formations into which it has miraculously evolved. So that is, both of these quotes were Hugo Riemann in the Grundriss der Musikwissenschaft, also quoted in Heyer and Reding in 2001 in the MGG article. No, in the Grove article. So let me read the last quote one more time. Musicologists should not only study, I quote, the simple, most basic manifestations of this tone material, but also the complex, richly differentiated formations into which it has miraculously evolved. End of quote. Besides music theory, Riemann contributed greatly to music history, but music theory and music history always interacted in Riemann's historical research, in that musical works were seen as, I quote, and this is quoted Heyer and Reding from their Grove article on Riemann, So in that, musical works were seen as, I quote, milestones on the path to the full historical realization of a timeless musical logic. No, I lost it. Of the timeless musical logic. Riemann thus completed his history of music theory with a developmental history of musical practice, a gradual evolution of tonal consciousness that culminated in the music of Beethoven. End of quote. Again, that was Higher and Rating in Grove Music Online, or the Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians from 2001. However, I will show later with my observations from Riemann's Musiklexikon that such a history that culminated in the music of Beethoven, is based on a different philosophical basis than the history of music after Beethoven, as one can see in the selection of 19th century composers in the dictionary. While the history through Beethoven is a history of music composition, the history after Beethoven is, at least partially, a history of music reception. This may be accidental, as the historical distance was not yet given, so that the music can become a, I quote, Riemann, a classical work of art that resists the destructive power of time, end of quote, as Riemann phrased it in his article Klassisch, in his music dictionary from its 4th edition on. So from 1894 on. But I will also look at national differences, and in the 2001 edition of the New Grove we can find the following passage about Riemann's historiography. And the article again is written by Higher and Rating, and it says there, I quote, historical or national stylistic differences being excluded from the core of the musical logic manifested themselves on a superficial plane which his theories did not presume to capture. Riemann was generally willing to grant different national traditions and historical periods their own developmental curves, all of which flow within a historical mainstream whose course is determined by the progressive actualization of a universal musical logic. For Riemann, the national tradition that formed the main current of that mainstream was the close affiliation of German music with his musical logic had assured its hegemonic position since the 18th century. End of quote. Higher and Rating in Grove Music Online, or New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians 2001. Riemann's music dictionary was unique in that articles on subject matters, musical instruments, and musical terms, as well as articles on musicians and composers, were written by one single author, Riemann, and on the basis of a systematic understanding of musicology, which largely entails music theory and music history. This concept must be seen as the reason for its success to become one of the most important encyclopedic music dictionaries of the first half of the 20th century, at least in German-speaking countries. But translations into English, French, Russian, and Danish, for instance, show the dissemination of the dictionary outside the German-speaking countries. I had listed some here. On your screen, you saw a list of these editions earlier. So now the second edition was essentially a reprint of the first with an added appendix that contained new dictionary entries and corrections. So the appendix did. The subtitle was dropped with the third edition. The 8th edition was the last one completely revised by Riemann himself. The 9th edition was revised by Riemann through letter K and completed from letter L on by Alfred Einstein, because that is the year Riemann passed away. It was most important to Hugo Riemann that the dictionary was in one volume to make it very practical in its use, to mix alphabetically explanations of terms and concepts with biographical notes on composers and musicians. Riemann's concept is that of a handbook. Furthermore, it was most important to Riemann that the list of works was as complete as possible. With regard to living composers, most of the information was attained through Riemann's personal contact to the composers. Riemann's lexicographic philosophy becomes evident in his prefaces to the various editions of his Musiklexikon. In the preface to the first edition, here I had one of the quotes that I read earlier by Heyer and Reding. So I will leave this up here, but I will now get to the next quote here. This is from the preface of the first edition, and Riemann wrote here, I quote, "This music dictionary should, for the first place, provide to the musician and to the music lover short and precise information about the lifetime, fate, and accomplishments of composers, virtuosos, and teachers of this art, about the history and the current state of the art itself, as well as of its theory and of musical instruments. Whenever possible, the relative extension of the articles was reconciled with the importance of its contents. Regarding the selection of articles, a certain limitation was necessary because of space considerations. Only this way the danger of meaninglessness of the articles because of a too high number of articles could be counteracted. The intelligibility to all was the highest law for the presentation. However, the author did not believe in going so far that eventually even practically educated orchestra musicians could not find more in the theoretical and historical articles than what they already know by themselves. As the book is, it will be of interest to the higher educated musician and the music researcher will stimulate the ambitious music lover. The attempt to create some interest in and understanding of the older periods of music history for more and more people may find an approval, considering the attempts that are gaining a broader and broader basis to revive the works from the 19th and 17th, from the 16th and 17th centuries." End of quote. Again, that was from the preface of the first edition, the 1882 edition. Riemann made several important points. First of all persons with an entry in his dictionary are of major importance, because he had to be very selective. However, longer articles are dedicated to the more important figures in music history. Second, the intelligibility to all readers was of utmost importance, although a certain depth had to be retained. Third, although older time periods are being considered, Riemann implied a special emphasis on most recent musical developments. And I didn't mention this before, but all these translations from these German books are by me. I translated. I tried to be as close to word by word translation as possible. In the preface to the 8th edition of his Musiklexikon, Riemann wrote, and that is here on your screen, "Each new edition requires new cuts or eliminations of articles from previous editions that became dispensable to preserve the practicality of the book in being in one volume. Many requests for inclusion in the new edition had to, for that reason, to remain unfulfilled. The author is asking not to see this as a lack of recognition, but the danger that the biographical dictionary of musicians would degenerate into an address book of musicians is greater than one may think. The most important purpose of this book is still to provide a reliable overview of important accomplishments in the area of composition on the one hand and of musicological research on the other, and only to a limited degree can the accomplishments of musicians, singers, instrumentalists, conductors, and music teachers be recognized. End of quote. That was from the preface to the 8th edition from 1916. I will get there in a second. Even more so than in the first edition does Riemann emphasize the fact that all persons listed in his dictionary are of major importance because many composers could not be included. This is especially important considering the discussions in the first part of this presentation. The many musicians and composers who are mentioned in Riemann's dictionary were indeed of great importance at the time, although many of them are forgotten today. An important question in my paper was the German focus of Riemann's Musiklexikon. While it would have taken an unreasonable amount of time to analyze every entry in every edition, I only analyzed all entries of composers and musicians that started with the letter A, specifically considering the first, 1882, and the fifth edition, the 1900 edition of the Musiklexikon. However, since certain nationalities may have a higher number of last names starting with a specific letter, I compared the 1900 edition of Riemann's dictionary with the 1900 edition, which is the first edition of Theodore Baker's A Biographical Dictionary of Musicians, published in the United States, and with Sir George Grove's 1900 revised reprint of his A Dictionary of Music and Musicians from 1900. The same year, 1900, was chosen to maintain a certain historical basis to compare the dictionaries, and this table will show or shows the results of these comparisons. I'll make this a little smaller so it will all fit in on here on one screen. The numbers in bold show the two most represented nationalities in each of the dictionaries. While Baker 1900 is very similar in its scope, the Grove Dictionary has, percentage-wise, a much higher emphasis on Italian and British composers and musicians. More specifically, many of the Italian composers and musicians are those who eventually worked in Great Britain. Baker's dictionary did not seem to support the idea that Riemann's dictionary was special as a mirror of German musical life, as Baker was expected to have a stronger American focus. A closer look, however, reveals that Baker must have borrowed much from Riemann's dictionary, as many of the entries in Baker's dictionary are clearly taken from Riemann, often with changed wording, but on occasions literally copied, word by word. Of course, one in German, one in English. The Riemann edition that Baker most likely used was the fourth edition from 1894. On some occasions, Baker misinterpreted the German article, such as in the entry on the German composer Friedrich Wilhelm Acte. And I will not read these, but if you're interested, pause the video and have a look at these. Baker may have also taken some information from the English translation of Riemann's fourth edition, which was published in Philadelphia in 1899. Right, I will get back to the second table in a little bit. Riemann implied in the preface to various editions of his Musiklexikon that there is a greater emphasis on recent, modern music, musicians, and composers, focusing on the number, absolute frequencies, on musicians and composers from different time periods, and comparing the numbers and percentages of composers and musicians that start with the letter A between the 1900 editions of Riemann, Baker, and Grove revealed this second table, revealed the following differences. While Riemann and Baker emphasized the most recent music historical developments, the 19th century, Grove included a higher percentage of musicians and composers from the 18th and 17th centuries. I started this paper with a summary of my research on the musical life of the Germans in Brno around 1920. I mentioned that some composers were celebrated then and forgotten today, but many composers that are famous for that time period from today's point of view were seldom performed and mentioned back then. One of these examples is the Czech composer Leoš Janáček. In Riemann's music dictionary, he was first mentioned in the 10th edition in 1922. On the other hand, the composer Alfred Abt, listed here, who was born in 1855 and died in 1888, was first mentioned in the 5th edition of Riemann. In 1900, he was last mentioned. He was first mentioned in 1900 and he was last mentioned in the 10th edition in 1922. Alfred Abt was a Kapellmeister in Rudolstadt, Kiel, and Rostock, and although born 1 year after Janáček, Abt was mentioned in the dictionary 22 years earlier than Janáček, but was then forgotten. Finally, let us have a look at a few other examples of composers that were added in a specific edition and dropped from Riemann's dictionary with a later edition. Bigo Andersen, 1852 through 1895, was mentioned in the 5th through 7th editions. Andersen was born in Copenhagen, was a solo flutist of the Thomas Orchestra, and a famous flute virtuoso. He committed suicide in Chicago. Karl Appel, 1812 through 1895, was mentioned from the 3rd through the 11th editions of Riemann's dictionary. Appel was a court concert master and was well known for his barbershop quartets and pedagogical violin compositions. He died in Dessau. Edmund Abessa, 1837 through 1889, was mentioned in the 4th and 5th editions. Abessa was born in Saxonia, was a composer of salon music, and composed the opera Die liebliche Fee, the charming fairy. He died in Vienna. Numerous other examples could be given of composers who were temporarily considered important composers, at least within Germany. Certain historical, social, political, and other situations led to forgetting them. Third chapter, the header is not here, but the third chapter is very brief comments on Hugo Riemann and other aspects of music historiography. Of course, one must consider Hugo Riemann's music history books, which are based on specific concepts of music historiography. Riemann makes it clear that music history cannot be put clearly into clear periods, but that there are ascending and descending developmental phases. I refer to what he wrote in 1901. In the preface to his 1901 book Geschichte der Musik seit Beethoven, 1800 through 1900, History of Music since Beethoven, he makes interesting statements regarding the relationship between music biographical presentations and music historiography. And that quote is here on your screen. As certain, I will make this bigger again. As certain major leading figures must also come into one's own, that means must be shown in their importance, if history should not fade to an abstract theorem and to dry statistics, the accumulation of the biographical material and its detailed portrayal of too many minor characters poses a critical danger for the interest in the actual purpose of the investigation, which is the practical development of artistic ideas and the evidence of its influence on the formation of the entire music practice and its position in the cultural life of the nations, to adhere to a certain midway and to enliven the specific art historical presentation via concrete figures should be our governing aspect of this work, meaning of the history of music since Beethoven 1800 through 1900. End of quote. So that was from the preface of this 1901 music history book. Thus, Riemann says one has to find a midway between including too many minor composers and the presentation of art historical developments. Riemann also explains his view on including subjective presentations of composers by contemporaries, that is, from the same book. And it says, he wrote, I do not find, quote, I do not find the concern essential that one can probably not give an unbiased historical account of a time period in which one still stands amid personal sympathies and antipathies and individual taste for all intents and purposes of a biased person. All historiography is based on the account and judgment of contemporaries, and to remove all individual coloration, biased presentation, would mean to kill the actual life. That a future time would measure particular phenomena of our day's time with other dimensions than we today is certainly very likely, but as the so subjectively colored and over time invalid becoming judgments by the contemporaries of the masters of the past are most valuable for us today for the understanding of the role which they played at their time. We can hope from our subjective time judgments today that they will not be worthless for a later reflective examination of the same period. End of quote. Thus, even the subjective presentation of certain recent historical developments or biographies is useful. It is useful now to reflect on our contemporary music, and it is useful for later generations to understand the roles that music and composers play today. It also means that Riemann's biographical dictionaries are very valuable for the understanding of the musical developments and the reception of the music of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. What I have not yet considered is how the presentations in Riemann's biographical Musiklexikon relate to his music history books and such as his history of music since Beethoven. A question one might ask is, which composers are listed in the dictionary that are not mentioned in his music history books? Those composers would certainly be, in Riemann's view, minor composers already from the contemporary perspective. Another question one might ask is, are there any composers mentioned in his music history books that are not listed in his Musiklexikon? That would certainly elevate the historical significance of that composer from Riemann's contemporary point of view. And finally, Riemann's view on music historiography changed over time. For one, Riemann's understanding of music historiography changed to be more autonomous. The inherent laws, die Eigengesetzlichkeit, the inherent laws of the musical developments had to be emphasized in the later volumes of his Handbuch der Musikgeschichte, the Handbook of Music History. Then the developmental history of musical forms and styles became the leading principle, as he said in 1907 in that handbook. Riemann wanted to show how one generation of composers built upon the work of the previous generation and how stringent the consecutiveness of musical styles is, as Georg Knepler said in Geschichte als Weg zum Musikverständnis, history as a means of understanding music. But these are discussions for future lectures. Final remarks. And instead of listing here the header, I will list some of the bibliography. and I will scroll down again later. In this lecture, I try to show that Riemann's Musiklexikon was and is indeed a good source for research on 19th and 20th century music. Many composers and musicians in various editions of Riemann's dictionary are forgotten today, and because Riemann's dictionary lists a high percentage of German composers, for many of these composers, the dictionary is one of the very few sources available today. My research on the musical life of the Germans around 1920, for which Riemann's dictionary was an excellent source of information, also revealed that musical events at the time had a socially and sociologically different function than our musical events today. Thus, we would have to search for reasons of forgetting some geniuses or heroes of that time in the different sociological circumstances. Therefore, music research based on today's social structures and circumstances, as I mentioned earlier, as displayed in today's dictionaries and history books, will fail with regard to the musical life of the past. Those music histories, and even or especially if we talk only about the composers one can find in today's music dictionaries and the reception of their works, will always be a history of composition and not a history of musical life. The latter would require us to rethink our methodological approach to music historiographic research. One of the most important keys for the understanding of music history, was given by Riemann in his article Klassisch, classical, in his music dictionary from its fourth edition on, in which he defined a classical work of art as one that, I quote, resists the destructive power of time. Again, a classical work of art resists the destructive power of time. Together with the information given by Riemann in the prefaces of the various editions of his dictionary, we can conclude that those composers and musicians that are included in his dictionary, many of whom are forgotten today, were indeed major composers from the perspective of late 19th and early 20th century music and musical life. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this. Feel free to contact me, to leave a message here below the video, or to Google my name, and you will find my email. Send me an email. I would love to hear from you. Thank you, and good luck on your research.